Hello, I'm Pastor Clark from St. Paul Lutheran Church in Clinton, Iowa, and we are going to do a little Bible study today. Sometimes from week to week, Sunday to Sunday, the lectionary has us just reading continuously, picking up in one week from where we left off the week before, and that's how it's working this week. So last week were the verses before this in Matthew 16, where Jesus and his disciples go to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asked them, "Who do the crowds say I am? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." It's the first time those words are spoken in the Gospel of Matthew. And then, Jesus goes on to change Peter's name and, kind of create this new community that Jesus calls the church, which in the Greek is a political word, not a religious word. And then right after that, we pick up with these verses, 21 to 28. These form the kind of core or the key initiating of this next narrative block, kind of the fourth narrative block in Matthew. There are six altogether, but then let's see, chapter 16, 17, 18, 19, even into 20 is kind of a reflection and an elaboration on what happens here. So what does it mean that Jesus is the Messiah? And what is the cross? What does it mean to take up your cross and follow Jesus, carry the cross? So this is the key passage in Matthew, so let's dive into it. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Okay, so there's a lot packed into one sentence here. From that time on, okay, so this is explicitly connecting this activity of Jesus of saying, "You guys, I'm going to die. I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. They're going to kill me there." He begins to say that because of what just happened, because of Simon Peter naming him as the Messiah, and the kind of foundation, the creation of a new community. Jesus makes Peter a new Abraham type figure, just like Jesus is a new Moses type figure from the point of view of Matthew. Okay, so these things it's not an accident. That's what the gospel is telling us. Jesus is intentional in this. So what's he showing him? He must go to Jerusalem and suffer. So going to Jerusalem is this is a shift. Jesus' ministry so far has been this in Galilee. Okay, Galilee is, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, that kind of nation of Israel, which is a client state of the Roman Empire at this time. And so Jerusalem, even though it was kind of the capital, so to speak, of all of Israel, including Galilee, Rome didn't exert the same kind of control in Galilee as it did in Judea, which was the region that the kind of subdivision of Israel that Jerusalem sat in. So this is much more a movement into enemy territory, so to speak. And Jesus has spoke already about the prophets and how no prophet can die outside of Jerusalem. So there's a resonance both in the specific geopolitics of the moment and of the long arc of, call it salvation history if you want, the way that God's been engaging God's people over a long period of time through the prophets and over against the kings. So then this suffering Who is involved in this suffering? The elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So this is kind of the heart of the both the political and the religious leadership of Israel. The elders kind of encapsulates that. A lot of Jesus' enemies specifically were Sadducees and Pharisees. And, so let's just take a step back and think about how the way we usually talk and teach about what's going on in the Gospels by how we define who the Sadducees and the Pharisees are. Okay, usually when we talk about Sadducees and Pharisees, we are talking about their religious beliefs and only. So then what we are doing is setting up this, framing this conflict that Jesus has been having with them from the beginning of the gospel. We set that up to be a conflict of religious ideas, right? Of religious ideology, a theological debate. But there's more going on with those folks, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So the Sadducees, they were kind of the high priestly sort of party or faction in Israel, but they were also the wealthy. They were moneyed people, wealthy people, as well as having high positions in the temple and in the kind of priesthood. The Pharisees, they were kind of traditionalists. They were a little bit like almost self-taught. I mean, that's not the quite the right way to put it. I mean, they had no lineage in the priesthood, is I guess the way I should say it. They were lay people, okay, but they were also part of the middle class. What small middle class there was. They were part of the urban middle class, okay. So right there is an economic dimension to this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? It wasn't just about ideas about God. It was also that Jesus was on the side of the kind of peasants, the rural and urban peasants that the Pharisees and Sadducees had no love for, had very little respect, maybe even hatred for. So Jesus is on the side of those, the economically disadvantaged, the like vast majority of people who are like on the margins, and starvation and debt and economic deprivation are kind of real parts of their lives. That's Jesus is with those folks, especially in Galilee, which is even farther out from the center of power, versus Sadducees and Pharisees who had more wealth, more power, more central place. So, basically, as long as we leave out the economic dimension of who the Pharisees and the Sadducees were, we lose the economic dimension of the conflict that they had with Jesus. This has been going on since the beginning of Matthew. And Jesus is basically saying, this conflict is going to escalate. I am going to escalate it by going into their territory, into Jerusalem, and it is going to end in my death, a death which I choose by going there. That's everything that is kind of contained in this one sentence. So that's a lot packed in there. Of course, it's be killed and on the third day be raised. Okay, don't lose that detail. Then Peter. Now remember, Peter just named Jesus as the Messiah. And when he did that, Jesus said, humans have not revealed this to you. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven, right? There's some sort of divine revelation, some inner awakening that God has created in Peter in order for him to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay? That just happened. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me because you're putting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Okay, so, it's not necessarily that the very next, moment in that interaction with Peter, but it's like, maybe we could say pride cometh before the fall. But what we definitely can say is while Peter is the kind of new Abraham, the kind of new father of a new community for Jesus, then if Peter gets this wrong, then there is a universal kind of misunderstanding. That is, we are indicted and included in this judgment that Jesus lays on Peter, calling him Satan. He goes from divine revelation is at work within him, and then being named Satan. You're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things, right? That was that dichotomy before. It wasn't human was divine when Peter said he was the Messiah. Now it's not divine, but human. When he misunderstands what that messianic calling is, what it means to be the Christ. These are, get behind me, get away from me. Yeah, these are like Jesus spoke this way to Satan back when he was tempted at the beginning of the gospel. And I've heard at least one suggestion that the vehemence of Jesus's rebuke to Peter may reveal how deeply tempting what Peter is saying was to Jesus. Okay, so Jesus was tempted in the wilderness by armies, right? All the kingdoms of the world in their splendor. There's a sense that is political power and is armies that comes along with that. And at the end of that temptation, it doesn't say, and Jesus conquered Satan once and for all. It says Satan left him until a more opportune time. So here it is. And Satan is coming in the guise of Peter. Peter, who seems to be saying, who can't imagine suffering, can't imagine Jesus suffering, but would rather have Jesus fight, Jesus win, Jesus claim political power. It's certainly true that while Jesus was in a battle with, the conflict with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were allies of Rome, of the Roman Empire, Jesus did not engage in conflict with zealots. Zealots were the kind of revolutionary faction in the life of Israel at the time. Those who wanted to throw off Roman rule, had a sense of the Messiah being a political ruler, a political liberator, someone who would cast off the chains of the Roman Empire and establish the monarchy. The King David would establish a new dynasty and kind of bring back the glory days of Israel when it was an independent monarchy in the world. Jesus doesn't have doesn't engage in public disagreement with the zealots nearly as much as with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In fact, he is condemned as a zealot. That's in the end, he's crucifixion was reserved for foreigners, rebellious foreigners, and for that small group of Roman citizens who were charged with treason or sedition. It wasn't just normal capital punishment. So he is mistaken as a zealot, even though right here, he's very clear that he does not have that in mind, that his kingdom is not about ruling over, but it is about liberation. So he by going to Jerusalem, he's basically throwing away a political victory, and Peter doesn't like the sound of that. Okay. Peter is also, by the way, seems to be ignoring this whole resurrection business. On the third day be raised. Like, I mean, it's almost like you had me at suffer and die. He couldn't get past those things. It's hard to say what, if at all, if that registered with Peter at all, the last bit about on the third day be raised. But maybe, we could say, how often do you tell God what to do? I mean, I recognize this in myself. Tell God what's best. Tell God how to do God's job. Prayer is not about bending God to our will. Prayer is how we surrender ourselves and let God transform our will into God's will, how to bring those things in alignment. And that's what Jesus is asking, demanding of Peter, is that he surrender his will, surrender his expectations, surrender what he wants. So then Jesus turns to the whole disciples. I mean, I sort of imagine this scene there. Peter pulls Jesus aside, kind of away from the others, but Jesus turns to include all of them in this conversation. He refuses to keep this disagreement private. This argument is not a private one. He makes it public. That seems very intentional. So he tells the disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. I think that in the Greek, it's actually more like, it's something like as if any want to become my followers, they have denied themselves, and taken up their cross, and now they've got to follow me. So it's past tense, present tense on those verbs of deny, take up, and follow. But here we have it in the English, all in the present tense. So if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. So it's sort of bracketed on both sides by following, followers, follow. I mean, there's kind of like a duh, but what's the following? It's in denying themselves and taking up the cross. And there's a sense of like denying themselves would be to refuse to be intimidated by political and religious leaders. By denying themselves would be to refuse to seek safety by siding with the elite, and that's there's a way that we can hide out. I think that's what the denying ourselves is all about, is about not hiding out. So there's the cross is a political image. I mean, nobody would have mistaken that when Jesus was speaking, that it's political enemies who get crucified. And so there's a core resistance that Jesus is describing, a resistance to imperial power, to a nationalistic power, resistance to a domination and control type way. This is all in the public sphere. Of course, there's an individual and an inner alignment with what that means in the big picture as well. So he's certainly inviting Peter to that personal stance. And so there is here's a call to martyrdom. There's really no way around that. That's like explicitly what Jesus is talking about. And if not to specifically being killed, then there isn't like an orientation of one's life to the margins, to be marginalized. This is not Jesus doesn't invite us to climb the ladders of success and power, which mean compromising the vision of the kingdom, but to kind of a downward mobility, not upward mobility, downward mobility, because we're identifying with, the nobodies. We're identifying with those who resist the empire's control and are who are casting a vision of God's freedom, God's kingdom, God's liberation, and who are vulnerable to reprisals because of that. Yeah. It's kind of, and also to reframe, part of what is going on in Matthew and in Jesus is, what's the victory? Why did Jesus have to die? What's the victory in the cross and resurrection? And for Matthew, it's the victory of showing the limits of the power of God's enemies. The limits of, Rome's power, imperial power, the limits of the religious leaders' power. The worst they can do is kill you. But there's something beyond that. Be killed and on the third day be raised. So it's basically a sign that this is a sign of the weakness of God's enemies, that they would use violence. Is the victory that Jesus demonstrates in the cross and in the resurrection. And so that finding our lives. Let's now go into the next section. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. What does it mean to find our life in following Jesus? It's, in refusing to give the elite, God's enemies, the power of intimidation and the power of conformity that they are craving and enforcing with violence, and that God gives a life. The life that we receive is a life that can fully receive and experience the kingdom of justice and love that Jesus is describing throughout Matthew, is enacting in his ministry. Look to the Beatitudes, look to all the healing and community building and things that Jesus does. So that's the life that we get to find. Because our time will be short. We had our first return to in-person worship this past Sunday. It went okay. And those are very brief services to keep us all safe. So I may cut this reading short right here, but so I'll speed through a little bit, verses 26 and on. There is, I'll just read it. So for what will it profit them, those who want to save their life, if they gain the whole world? This is a cultural, political, economic, you climb to the top of that ladder, if you gain the whole world but forfeit their life, or what will they give in return for their life? Because the Son of Humanity is to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Humanity coming in his kingdom. This is implicit in verse 25, what verses 26 through 28 kind of say. And that's something that's very close to everything going on in Matthew is the end, capital T, capital E, the end. is always very close to the surface in Jesus' teaching in Matthew. That it's almost like Jesus is constantly trying to give us a view of the present from the point of view of the end. We've talked before about Jesus Jesus inviting people that faith is living in the present moment with fidelity to the end, with loyalty to the end, living in the present as if the end had already come. And so that is present here in these verses. There is a sense of where do you want to be at the end? And so what is living in this present moment calling forth from us if we are going to live truly and authentically to the end that we know God is going to bring, with or without us. God is going to make this happen. And so where do we want to be standing then at the end? And what is it going to take? What do we have to do in the meantime to do that? And Jesus talks about that metaphorically in terms of denying ourselves, taking up our cross, and following Jesus. This moment also looks forward to Gethsemane, where Jesus is wrestling again. We can suppose with temptation, the same temptation. Satan left him looking for a more opportune time. Here is a more opportune time, and then later in Gethsemane, on the eve of his crucifixion, it happens again. And Jesus is very specific, asking Peter to stay with him and stay awake so that he can, stay awake with me in resisting temptation. So it very well may be that this is a real temptation for Jesus to seek political power, to rule instead of to liberate. And if it was real for Jesus, it is most certainly real for Peter. And if it is for Peter, then most certainly for us. And what is it that we have to surrender? Which loyalties, which comforts, which habits of self-preservation, habits of taking our lives into our own hands. What will it take for our wills to be fully merged and united with God's? A lifelong process, one that I turn to the mystics, turn to contemplation, and that form of prayer to help me with, but also that's what I see the church as being. That we are people who are letting go of what we want, and not my will, but yours be done. Those were Jesus's words in Gethsemane. We can claim those as our words too, as we, like Peter with Jesus, seek to resist that temptation to try to save our own lives, and take up the same courage that was in Jesus, to sort of lose on purpose in a way, lose in a way that creates the possibility for a win, that puts it in God's hands rather than trying to secure it in our own. Okay, so I think I'll end there, and wish you pray for your health, and pray for your enlivening, that you would keep your mind on divine things and not on human things, and that we could hold each other to that, just like Jesus holds Peter. Okay? All right, be well.